What's going on, guys? My name is Evan Peel. Today I've got a pretty interesting topic for you. We're going to be talking about ATC controllers that help save pilots' lives in emergency situations. A lot of the times you hear about pilots that landed on the Hudson or barrel rolled through cities to dodge buildings and crashed through fires and stuff like that and saved lives, but you never hear about the air traffic controllers that helped the pilots out. So I thought this would be an interesting topic to talk about and shed some light on all that air traffic controllers do for pilots on a daily basis. Today we will be talking about three different stories. The first one titled with Ditch It or Fly It, the second one the suicidal flight, and the third being the pilot is deceased. These are three different stories that are unique in their own way, but they all involve an air traffic controller that helped to save lives. After we discuss these stories, we will then talk about what can be learned from them. What are their biggest takeaways? Our first story begins in the summer of 1952 at Thule Air Base on Greenland's northwest coast. Mr. Bob Tracy, a 23-year-old U.S. Air Force technical sergeant, was manning the tower at the time. Now, keep in mind, the Thule Air Base is located roughly 700 miles north of the Arctic Circle, so it gets very, very cold there. The sun hadn't yet set when he received a call from a Royal Air Force Lincoln bomber flying over the ice cap from Scotland. The crew reported that they were lost. At extreme latitudes, a compass is pretty much useless, so the region was divided into a grid. Each runway had a grid heading. In order to navigate, the pilot had to set the gyroscope to the known grid heading in order to navigate. The crew had drifted off course due to the failure of their gyro. Night was closing in and the crew was running out of options. There were talks about bailing out amongst the crew members, but Tracy advised them not to bail no matter what because he knew that bailing out would result in death due to extremely cold weather. Thule Air Base had an NDB that had a 30 nautical mile range, and Tracy knew that the Air Force had a new and very powerful radar station just 4 miles north of the base. He called some technicians, and they were able to use the new radar system to find the Lincoln bomber. They located the bomber just 100 miles north of the base. Tracy turned the plane toward the airport's general direction. Once the bomber got within 30 nautical miles, they were able to pick up the NDB. It was now nighttime and they faced another problem. The airbase did not have any lights. So Tracy rushed to call all ground crew and had them line up all ground vehicles along the runway and turn their lights on. The Lincoln bomber was able to land safely, and if it wasn't for Tracy and his creative thinking, the crew would have been dead on the ice. On February 19th, 2010, Dan Boyle was working the graveyard shift at the Southern California Trade Con in San Diego when he got the call. It was Sky Turner, a 23-year-old private pilot, and he sounded very anxious. Turner was alone and flying a Cirrus SR-22. Boyle had later discovered that Turner had stolen the airplane from Montgomery Field in San Diego after a flight with his girlfriend, and he planned to commit suicide by flying it into the ocean. But he was beginning to have some second thoughts. Turner was neither instrument rated nor trained to fly the Cirrus. Boyle directed him towards Los Angeles International Airport. Boyle also had to force Turner down into a cloud layer at about 3,600 feet. Turner started his ascent but then got pretty nervous and climbed back up above the cloud layer. Boyle eventually talked Turner down and he was able to make a descent, assisted by the airplane's autopilot and GPS system, which locked onto the airport localizer. After one go around, Turner was able to successfully land the airplane visually. If it wasn't for Mr. Dan Boyle, who knows what would have happened to Sky Turner. He did a really great job at talking very calmly with him and helping him get down to the ground and guiding him. In 2009, on Easter Sunday, a pilot by the name of Doug White calls Miami Center stating that his pilot has deceased. The pilot of the King Air 200 was found unconscious and soon after died. Doug White, his wife, and two teenage daughters were flying from Marco Island, Florida, to Jackson, Mississippi for Easter Sunday. Mr. White had piloted single-engine airplanes before, but had never flown nor was certified in a twin-engine turboprop airplane. After Mr. White made the call, it was all hands on deck. Miami Center controller Jessica Anaya immediately rerouted all airplanes in the area. Nathan Hinkle and Lisa Graham began to instruct White, helping him to deactivate the autopilot and stop his descent. After that was accomplished, White requested the longest and widest runway. Graham accepted his request and sent him toward the Southwest Florida International Airport and Myers. It had a 12,000-foot runway which was served as a backup landing site for the space shuttle. At Fort Myers, controller Brian Norton and Dan Favio were communicating with White. Mr. Favio decided to make a quick phone call to a close friend by the name of Kerry Sorensen in Danbury, Connecticut. Sorensen was a pilot and flight instructor and had thousands of hours in a King Air 200. He pulled out his manuals and he told Favio how to configure airspeed, flaps, and trim to prepare White for the landing. With the help of Sorensen, Favio, and Norton, White was able to successfully land at Fort Myers. Norton handed White off to ground where he spoke to Kerry Meadows, who assisted him in shutting down the aircraft. The six controllers, Anaya, Graham, Hinkles, Favio, Norton, and Meadows, won the Southern Region's Archie League Medal of Safety Award for 2009, as well as the President's Award for the Best Flight Assist in the country. So, what are our biggest takeaways from the stories? Our first one is to never give up. Bob Tracy had to work with little resources as well as a lackadaisical crew, but he never gave up and was able to safely guide the bomber to the airport. Our next takeaway is to stay cool, calm, and collected and trust your training. Boyle got the call from Mr. Turner stating that he was suicidal and ill-equipped to fly the airplane in the weather conditions that were current. But despite the major stressors that had occurred, Boyle was able to remain calm and talk Turner down to the airport where he safely landed. And lastly, use all available resources and communicate specifically and clearly with one another. In our last story, the six controllers had to work together in order to successfully aid Mr. White and his family to the airport and to the ground. They also had to communicate back and forth between each other to apply White with correct landing configurations. It is important to reflect on the stories and recognize the importance of air traffic controllers. Remember that they are always there to help no matter what the circumstance may be. Here is my source. I obtained these stories from an article on Air and Space magazine titled Heroes in the Tower, written by Mike Calisius. If you want to read more stories that are similar to the ones we discussed today, or you want to read more about the stories that I talked about today, feel free to go there and check that out.